Hi everyone, in this video we're going to discuss the Colorado Gambit, which is gaining popularity because it leads to relatively fresh positions and hence may be used as a surprise weapon in Blitz and rapid games. At the end of the video there will be an exercise for you, so make sure to watch till the end. And if it is the first time for you on this channel, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to be notified about the new content. After e4, Black responds with the knight to c6. It is already not the main line, but if we enter something like d4 and d5, well, it's pretty much well-known direction. So in many cases, White tries to avoid this d4, d5 line with the help of knight to f3, which is quite normal reaction. And in many cases, if Black responds with the natural move, like for example e5 or d5 or d6, we may have the normal opening line with some slight transposition. But in this position, Black may try something really weird like f7, f5. And that is the starting position of the Colorado Gambit. So what's going on here? It looks like a very risky attempt because in open games, whenever you weaken h5, e8 diagonal, you put your king at risk. That's a well-known fact. But it appears that in this particular case, White doesn't have a chance to really exploit it. So the strategic idea behind f5 is also not so hard to understand. Black is trying to undermine the central pawn, exchange it, and then gradually get some edge in the center, having simply more pawns being able to occupy central squares. So White may want to keep the central control here, and there are two options to consider. They are e takes f5 and e5. First, let's have a look at the most natural one. It is capturing the pawn. In this case, Black usually responds with the d7, d5, immediately occupying the central square, which is no longer controlled by the pawn, and attacking the pawn on f5. So anything that is connected with being greedy here, trying to protect the pawn, to keep it on the board, comes at cost of losing the control over central squares or just moving same pieces several times. So in other words, violating opening principles. So White should respond here in a normal way, trying to fight for central squares. Let's have a look at two examples when Black gets exactly what they want. For example, White tries a good-looking move d4, which can be more natural than just to put the pawn on the central square, control e5, c5, and prepare the development of the dark squared bishop. Well, in this case, bishop captures on f5. And we can see that the advantage of this approach for Black is that castling alone is almost ready. All Black needs here is just to put the queen somewhere and castling. For example, bishop to d3, bishop to g4. So Colorado is full of these tricks in the center, which is pretty logical because e5 is weakened and Black wants to play e5 at some point. So the knight is one of the main pieces that controls that square. Black now pins it. For example, if White plays c3 protecting d4, Black plays exactly this e5 move, and after d takes e5 and knight takes e5, Black has no problems whatsoever. For example, in this line, everything is being exchanged on f3, and then Black plays knight to f6, let's say. So, no problems with the development. Black has extra central pawn. I guess Black successfully solved all the opening problems. Another option for White is to try h3 right after bishop g4. Let's have a look at that one. So in this position, White plays h3, ignoring the fact that d4 is under pressure, because after bishop takes f3 and queen takes f3, there is a threat of queen h5 check. So that's a normal result of Black's f7, f5, weakening the diagonal h5, e8. So in this position, Black responds with a knight to f6, controlling h5 square, combining this with just the normal development, and now d4 is under attack. White may try bishop to b5 here, pinning the knight and trying to make Black's pawn structure more vulnerable, because before Black played e7, e5, this pawn structure is quite bad because of numerous weaknesses here. But appears that black may be not in a rush even with playing something like e5 and may even allow the further damage of the pawn structure here. For example, after e6, queen to e2, and strange move king to f7, so black may do something like this as well. Bishop captures c6 and b takes c6. Well, although the pawn structure looks bad, but white cannot really prevent black from doing something active with it. For example, after castling, black may play c5. After something like rook to e1, just queen to d7, protecting e6, c3, bishop to d6, and, well, black is gradually improving the position. Yeah, black has some weaknesses, no questions, but black successfully compensates it with very solid control over central squares and activity of the pieces. And the fact that the king is on f7 is not that critical. So in these situations, it's impossible for white to attack it, and it's usually just a question of 1 or 2 moves to bring it to a safer square. So all you need is just to bring the rook somewhere, and king is ready to go to g8, if it is needed. So these are 2 typical examples of what black is trying to get in this line. So not very standard pawn structure in the center, some active play based on c5 or e5. Let's have a look how white can prevent all of this and fight for central squares in a much more ambitious way. So in this position, instead of making d4 move, white may continue with the development of the king side and play bishop to b5, immediately pinning the knight, and hence increasing the pressure on e5 and d4 squares. Black responds with the bishop takes f5, it's pretty natural. And now the knight immediately jumps to e5, attacking the knight on c6. Pay attention, it is much more active approach for white to try. We can also notice that this way, white opens the queen. Now the queen has the access to h5 square, and this may be annoying for black in certain lines. One of the main lines here is queen to d6, protecting the knight on c6 and attacking the knight on e5, and at some point being ready to castle. White continues with the d4 here, supporting the knight on this great square e5 and preparing something like bishop to f4. Knight to f6. In this situation, white may castle. Then knight to d7. Again, we're following one of the popular lines here. So black is fighting for e5 square, which is very logical strategy. Otherwise, white will have no problems just supporting, overprotecting this knight on e5. And as a result, we'll have an amazing outpost for free. So in this position, white may try knight to c3 move. So pay attention to some dynamics in the position. If black decides to take on e5, d5 will be captured as a result. So you can look at this yourself. So normally black responds with the e6. Again, very logical continuation, protecting d5. And now again, knight on e5 is under some pressure. So the knight can step back at this moment. And this position is really interesting because white is ready to play bishop to f4. Different things are connected with knight to f4. Maybe at some point the bishop may become a target after g4. So black should be very, very careful at this point. In one of the games, black decided just to eliminate that knight because it indeed looks very annoying. And after bishop captured on d3, once again white created a threat of queen to h5. So knight came back to f6. White responded with the immediate knight to b5, attacking c7. Very aggressive play. Queen to d7, rook to e1. Again, very concrete continuation. There is a threat of rook e6 followed by knight to c7 fork. Black responded with the king to f7. We have already seen that. It's maybe not that bad for black. But in this position, white has a follow-up. So bishop went to f4, attacking c7. After rook to c8, white played queen to e2. And now we can see that white is perfectly developed and there is just a pressure on e6. In fact, there is already a concrete threat of just taking on c7. Twice, deflecting the queen as a result, and then finishing the game with the queen to e6. So already here, black has serious problems. Of course, it's just one of the lines, one of the games, but it shows the advantage of this another approach. So fighting for central squares in a much more aggressive way with white pieces. Now let's have a look at the starting position of the Colorado Gambit to investigate a bit the other direction, which is not accepting the Gambit, but rather grabbing some space with the e5. So here, right after f5, white may consider e5 move, which also looks pretty logical, grabbing space, controlling some important squares. So in this case, black's natural strategy is to undermine this pawn immediately before white managed to add another pawn to the center, like d4, and smash black completely with pushing pawns. So d6 attacks the e5, and if white captures on d6, and black recaptures this way, this is probably exactly what black wants, because now it's really hard for white to stop black from playing e5, building very strong pawn center. So white should definitely avoid it. And there is a method. Once again, it is based on this bishop to b5 pin, whereafter black may try very interesting d takes e5. It looks very dubious from a positional point of view, because now after knight takes e5, we can see that there is a hole on e5, and it's really hard to get rid of this knight. Indeed, if black doesn't get any counterplay right now, long term it will be very bad position. Most likely the pawn structure will be damaged, so black should have something immediately in response to this knight to e5. And that is queen to d5 move. Pretty sharp continuation, attacking three pieces in white's camp: the knight, the bishop, and the pawn on g2. Now white has a choice. So the first move that comes to mind is to take on c6 with the knight, which doesn't quite work because of, for example, queen takes g2. I mean, it doesn't give white anything specific. So after that, knight may go to e5 with check. Black continues with the c6, attacking the bishop. And now the bishop is hanging and the rook as well. So probably the best way for black to play is bishop takes c6, followed by queen to f3, protecting the rook and forcing the exchange of queens. And this ending should be pretty balanced, because yes, pawn structure is quite vulnerable in black's camp, especially on the queen side and in the center, but black has pair of bishops, and we can notice that some light squares in white's camp are already also weakened. So knight takes on c6 is probably not the best option. Let's have a look at bishop takes c6. So in this position, bishop captures on c6 with check, and of course b takes c6 is forced. And now we can see that the knight is hanging and the pawn is hanging. And it appears that the best way for white to play here is just to come back with the knight to f3, because other continuations are tricky and probably lead to play that black is actually going to get when they choose this opening. For example, if queen goes to h5, which at first glance looks very promising, black just responds with a g6. And it appears that after knight takes g6 and knight to f6, you should remember this pattern. So in many cases, if you don't know the theory, you may just break your calculation somewhere around knight g6 move, thinking that, okay, it's over, h takes g6 leads to queen h8. But knight to f6 is an intermediate move. In this particular case, you have a chance to keep the queen on the h file. Sometimes you cannot, so it may be just a blunder for you. So in this particular case, queen goes to h3, for example, and then black may continue with the h takes g6, sacrificing the material. But after queen to h8 and queen to g2, the rook is under attack, and the only way to save it is to play rook to f1, but it doesn't quite help because black continues with the knight to g4. And as you can see, white is completely underdeveloped here, and there is a shred of knight takes h2 actually grabbing that rook at the end, and white doesn't have a satisfactory defense. So all this action with the queen to h5 backfires. So instead of doing that, white should choose the modest knight to f3. Let's have a look at that one. So the knight goes to f3, and it may look like black has a chance to play e5 to grab central control, but this pawn may easily become a target. We shouldn't forget that the queen on d5 is quite vulnerable, so if you consider something like e5, you should take into account lines like knight to c3, queen to a5, then immediately queen to e2, attacking it. And then the pawn is on the e file together with the king. So if you continue with the e4, there may be d3, so on and so forth. So as you may notice, black is definitely underdeveloped here for keeping this pawn successfully. Well, again, maybe it's not the best line, not all the moves are necessarily forced, but I'm just showing you the idea behind it. Now, that's why black is usually trying to avoid playing e5 in this position. Instead, black may try some like queen e4 check, and at the very first glance it may look like simply the best continuation, because after white's queen to e2, which looks like the only move if white wants to avoid playing some like king f1, which is extremely ugly. Now, c2 pawn is hanging, but taking that pawn will be extremely dangerous for black, because in that case, white continues with the knight to c3. Right now, the queen is almost trapped, so we're talking about threats like, let's say, knight to d4. In addition to just continuing the development and gradually getting to attack against black's vulnerable pawns and vulnerable squares. Doesn't look like a good idea for black. Black may try something like queen captures on e2 or knight to f6, supporting the queen. In other words, just allowing the ending. And white may try to force it, something like d3, queen e2, king e2. And we have seen something similar already, but without pawns c7 and g2. So again, black has a worse pawn structure here, and black will try to compensate it with a pair of bishops. So position is interesting and probably playable with both colors. My personal preference here is white, so I like the knight in such a situation compared to the bishop. But again, a question of taste mainly. Now let's get to the exercise part and discuss one additional and interesting line. So here's the position after queen to d5. We have discussed knight takes c6 and bishop takes c6. But what about queen to h5? Check. What do you think is happening here? So your task is to calculate and to come up with the evaluation of this line. Feel free to stop the video and restart it whenever you feel like you are ready. And we're going to discuss the solution right now. So after this check, black continued with the g6 move. And after knight captures on g6, immediately recaptures with the pawn. This way sacrificing the exchange. Queen captures on h8. Now black gets the pawn on g2, attacking the rook. And the only sensible way for white to save that rook is to play rook to f1. So right now, white is in exchange up, but black has better pawn structure, it's an important factor, and seemingly better chances to complete the development. And also pay attention to the vulnerability of the king. There are too many squares that are no longer protected with pawns. And if you imagine that the knight is free to move and is not pinned, and squares like d4 or e5 are not controlled, well, it's really simple to imagine the maneuver of the knight through e5 or d4 towards f3. It may easily become a very dangerous attack against white's king. That is why here black has compensation and may even continue with the bishop to d7, completely ignoring that the knight on g8 is under attack. Now, let's have a look at what happens if white actually captures it. So after queen to g8, black continues with the knight to d4 move. And after bishop d7 and king to d7, white has extra rook. But the king's position is so bad that it doesn't give white any advantage. In fact, after queen to c4 and queen to e4, white has nothing better than just to agree that this is a draw. So the game ends with this good-looking perpetual. If white tries to play this position for a win and tries different things, not taking the knight on g8, black is getting very promising position. Let's have a look at that one. For instance, a logical idea could be just to try to come back home with the queen using this h4 square. So the point is to bring the queen to g3 and try to exchange queens. In this case, black may continue with the e5 occupying the center and showing that the pawn structure is better. Another idea behind e5 is obviously to control d4 square, so that knight d4 becomes a possibility, becomes an option. After the move queen to g3, black may try queen to e4 check. Then after queen to e3, take the pawn on c2. And in this position, we have seen, by the way, a similar pattern. It appears that the fact that queen is almost trapped on c2 is not that critical, because there are some tactical features that enable the counterplay based on the weakness of light squares. So black may continue with the knight to e7 here, supporting the knight. So if bishop takes, then knight takes, and again, knight will be ready to jump to d4. And if white tries to trap the queen this way with the bishop to d3, then black may play knight to b4, attacking the bishop and protecting the queen. And after bishop takes c2, it's just an exchange, because after knight takes c2, it is a fork. And after, for example, king e2, knight captures on e3, d takes e3, the game enters the ending where white has an extra exchange for just one pawn. But we should understand that black has pair of bishops, better pawn structure, so white has some vulnerabilities here. And after something like e4, it becomes even more apparent, because we can easily imagine maneuvers like this with occupation of very nice outposts in white's camp. And the bishop is quite passive, so everything says that black has sufficient compensation and maybe even a bit more. So as a result of this quick analysis, we can conclude that queen h5 is not that great continuation. Well, probably with the accurate play, it's not dangerous for white, but it's at the same time nothing that promises white any a hint of the advantage. I hope you solved it, or at least benefited from the analysis. I hope that this video was useful for you to get some basic ideas of the Colorado Gambit. Once again, want to emphasize that it is not a theoretic manual, so if you want to play it with either white or black, you should make your own investigation. But if you liked this introduction to the Colorado Gambit, don't forget to press the like button. Thanks a lot, and see you next videos.